Okay, in the last class, what we were trying to especially do is to lay out the primary ideas that were competing for dominance in the Republic of Letters of France in the 1750s to the 1770s. We also kind of laid out that as these ideas are competing for dominance, there's also kind of an emerging international competition that's taking place mostly between the French and the British, but the Spaniards are also part of it because they dominate Latin America with their colonies. And you could also say the Ottomans are part of it, but the Ottomans are clearly the Ottoman Empire by this point it's waning. It's waning, okay? So, and the reason we're looking at these various figures, and just to be clear about this, right? Sometimes I think you all, like you grow up and you think, oh, right? You might think, oh, and you might think this falsely, right? But you might think, oh, the people that are older than me that are Catholic, like they're trained in Thomism or something like that, okay? And there might be a few who are, thanks be to God, right? But in this time that we're talking about, like the Dominicans and Santa Maria sopra Minerva are like just preserving the tradition. But there's really not a real sense of, there's not a significant sense of it. And there might be some Jesuit schools that have like a Thomistic tradition. But there's not a significant sense in the most important countries of the world of using Catholic doctrine as like a seed that could help you understand how to create just political institutions reflecting the common good or working towards the common good or anything like that. The vast majority of Catholics, and we got into this little bit at dinner where, like, I was trying to tell you, like, look, the people in the 1760s in France, they really did follow Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Catholics embraced Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And if they didn't embrace Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they embraced John Locke and his ideas. There was a real strong opinion, right, that Locke or Rousseau or Voltaire or someone like that kind of had new answers or new starting points for solving the problems of this world. So naturalism, in a sense, you could say from an intellectual standpoint, even though it's, at dinner tonight, someone was looking at me horrified as I was saying this, like, who in their right mind could embrace Rousseau? Right? It wasn't you. It was the person sitting next to you. Right? Like me, because he was like saying, well, there's no way. I mean, he started arguing. Like, there's no way they could embrace Rousseau. Well, no, they did embrace Rousseau at that time. I'm sorry to say. But they did. Right? Just like some people rush into the arms of Jordan Peterson now. Okay? So we kind of went over, like, first of all, Voltaire. Voltaire was clearly more of like a political man than a philosophical man. He really saw himself as the leader of a movement that he hoped to someday become a revolutionary movement that would overturn what he thought was like the Catholic constitutional order in France, and it would deliver something like the British monarchy, where there's a limited monarch, nobody takes religion seriously. Maybe they all go to some service on Sunday, but everybody's kind of a skeptic, and they're dedicating to building up the empire. Maybe you're religious so that the bishops can tell you, like, to get your vaccines and to enlist in the army, I mean, that's kind of right, that's kind of in their view, and in the view of the British Empire, or what Voltaire was hoping for the French, this would be the extent of religious power, right? But Voltaire was always in alignment with, but kind of an uneasy alignment with, the radicals, people like Diderot, D'Alembert, Holbach. And these people were basically, by the 1770s, by 1760s, 1770s, they were proposing what we need is a materialist universal system. And they were using the word, we need a system based on materialist principles that will recognize universal rights. Where do you get these rights from? You get these rights from your inner perceptions of what's necessary for freedom and equality. Yes?
Sorry, who proposed that they need a system?
Radical Enlightenment. D'Alembert, Holbach, Diderot. the Radical Enlightenment in France. Okay, and they also started speaking of the need for a machine. Right? You're going to need to conceive of society as a machine, and the machine will have to function correctly in order for this universal system to operate the way it should. There was one party, there was a group of sympathizers also with what's called the Scottish Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment were characters like Reed, Adam Smith, Hutchinson. The people of the Scottish Enlightenment, essentially, you could say that they had philosophical disagreements with the Lockeans or with Rousseau. They based their theories on the idea, well, there are empirical experiences that we can base our knowledge on. And we should try to gather up as much information as we can about these experiences. And what do we do with them? We use either our common sense or our moral sense. I mean, they didn't have any kind of robust notion of the human person, body and soul, directed towards a good. But they did say we can use either our common sense or our moral sense in order to direct people to their proper balance, to the proper equilibrium. And they did believe in a kind of providential deism, if there's two such things are possible to put together, right? But they did believe in it. But for them, providential deism meant, well, history works itself in such a way so that there's a ruling class. I mean, David Hume is a great example of, who knows if he believed in God, but he did believe in providential deism, right? All history and all traditions, all the history of England leads to the predominance of the Whig ruling class in England, right? And Adam Smith was a little bit this way as well. So if we develop fields like economics and commerce, we're doing this to preserve order. We're doing this to preserve, and order is that the ruling class can keep itself as the ruling class. And so like one of Smith's interpretation of providential deism was, well, of course the poor people, we've already said this, poor people should be happy to adulate the rich, to serve at their tables and abide by their dictates. Because if you're wealthy, that means God has placed you there and everybody else owes you something, right? Or in another place, Smith will say, well, if after there were wars in the 1740s, 50s, 60s between the Catholic Highlanders and in fact, at one point the Catholic Highlanders invaded England, the Highlanders of Scotland, right? So one of the things the British got, Rob Roy is I don't know if you ever saw the film, but Rob Roy is one of the leaders of the Catholic Highlanders who basically tries to invade Britain at some point. Braveheart, right? He's a Catholic Highlander. Well, at one point, one of the things that actually the British government does is they hire Adam Smith to deal with the Catholic Highlander problems, right? And basically they come up with some sort of economic scheme. And Adam Smith says, they've asked me to get rid of unnecessary mouths, right? And so he comes up with this scheme, and it's a perfectly understandable scheme, right? What are we going to do? Like the Catholic Highlanders, from the standpoint of the British, they just wanted to stay in the mountains. They wanted to, have their sheep, have their little flocks, run their little farms, right? And they didn't want to integrate into the emerging economy of the Scottish lowlands. And Adam Smith and the British government said, well, the only way we're going to solve our Catholic Highlander problem is that we have to assimilate the Catholic Highlanders into the Scottish lowlands. Well, how are we going to do that? So Smith came up with the proposal. The proposal is, we'll try to sell them diamond buckles. And we know that because they don't really have a modern economy, of course, once we try to sell them, because the Scottish Highlanders are really proud of their diamond buckles, because that's how you would distinguish one clan from the other. And a diamond buckle was something to brag about, at a get together or something like that, right? So Smith comes up with this idea. What we'll do is we'll sell them diamond buckles, but they don't have the money to buy the diamond buckles, so we'll get them into debt, right? And then once they're in the debt to buy the diamond buckles, we'll basically lower the prices so they can't get anything in return if they try to sell the diamond buckles. But since they'll be in debt, then we can use that debt basically at some point. They won't be able to repay it, and so then we can then take their land. When we take their land, they'll have to move into the lowlands and work in the factories. We can pay them nothing, and it will eliminate the culture of the Highlanders, right? So it's for Adam Smith, like that, that's how we're going to use the economy to get rid of unnecessary mouths. So,
Did he succeed?
yeah, I mean, he was fairly successful, yeah. Yeah, because people never know that these are the plots that are being, hatched against them. So that effectively, over the course of a generation, it neutralized Scottish Highlander culture. And actually, it began to be used, the British, it was so successful, the British began to replicate it with native populations all over the world. It was like it became a kind of classic technique for governing the empire. So we also saw that, as the 60s and 70s go on, at the beginning of the 1760s and 70s, Voltaire gets kind of exposed as a fraud. And it's interesting, by the time Voltaire dies, he's remembered in history as a radical, as like a leader of the radical Enlightenment. Though he would be horrified to be remembered that way. Because he always thought that he would be this kind of a proponent of the moderate Enlightenment, that he would rein in the radicals. I want to get to the revolution that leads to the revolution, right? The revolution that leads to the French Revolution, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I just want to say something about Latin America and Asia, right? Because, at this point, the European powers really don't get into Africa, right? There might be some coastal colonies that take slaves and send them to the New World, but there's really no penetration into Africa until the 19th century. Latin America is essentially a series of colonies of Spain. And the reason I want to go into Latin America a little bit and Spain in this course is because, we deal with Spaniards. Let's face it, right? No, at some level, you got. It's helpful to understand what's the political philosophy of the Spanish Empire, and how, why was our father called a Carlist at some point? Why was he accused of being a Carlist? What does that mean? Right? Most Spaniards don't even know. So this will give you one up on them. Right? I found that out this summer when I was explaining to the Spaniards at Elmbrook what a Carlist was. And they didn't know. But it also helps you understand how, the Spanish Civil War, Franco, and so basically at this point in Latin America, almost every part of Latin America, whether it's Brazil, which is run by the Portuguese, or the rest of Latin America, which is run by the Spaniards, it's essentially part of the colonial system. As far as we can tell, there were very few bishops that you would consider as part of the equivalent of the French devout party, right? That the vast majority of bishops in Latin America are regalists. They're naturalists at this point. They're annoyed by the presence of the Jesuits in Latin America itself. They're basically docile to the Spanish kings, and the Spanish kings and their court at this point are essentially regalists and naturalists. Yes.
What's a naturalist?
A naturalist is John Locke, the Scottish Enlightenment. It's someone who just believes we're sense perceptions and instincts, and we got to figure out how to organize life based on coming up with rules to discipline our sense perceptions and instincts. Or there are some naturalists that say, forget about the rules, they're forms of corruption, like Rousseau. We just have to look into our inner feelings and get rid of civilization in as much as prevents us from looking into our feelings. Yes?
Brother Jeff, from the perspective of the church, they're totally fine, or is sort of indifferent at this time in terms of what people are adopting as sort of their philosophical system?
As far as I can tell, yeah. There's a small minority of hard-headed, black reaction Catholics, right, who are somewhat critical of the naturalists, and they do write tracts against them. But as far as like in the court of the princes, and as far as like the training in seminaries to be, or people that can become bishop, there's very little criteria. If anything, there's kind of a flattery of naturalism. Like this is the wave of the future. I mean, kind of like, American Catholics got caught up with, Kinsey and all this sex science stuff in the 60s and 70s in this country. And that was the wave of the future. So they tried to reorder seminary life to respect the studies that Kinsey did in the 50s and 60s. It's the 1972 guide for running seminaries. In some places, still in effect.
What did Kinsey say?
Wait, it has course offerings about Kinsey?
Well, it tries to implement into the formation Kinsey's conclusions.
Like what?
So, for example, to become a mature person, you need to have a variety of sexual experiences before you can actually become a mature person. Yes.
Sorry, what is black reaction?
That's another term for Catholicism among the moderate and radical
Does
Enlightenment
it
people.
refer to like a particular strain of Catholicism?
Yeah, like Jesuits.
Okay.
People that take the Catholic faith seriously, that think it should still be lived. Huh? Well, because they would wear black cassocks, so it's the black reaction. Now, because of the missionaries, and one of the things the missionaries and the Jesuits do, especially in Latin America, is they give great social and political and religious importance to the confraternities. The confraternity is basically a group of people that are dedicated to a devotion of like the Sacred Heart or a saint. And they organize social and political life a lot of times around these confraternities. They did this because in many places, as it is to this day, the priest can't make regular trips into these places, so they organize the leaders among the Indians to run these confraternities, which become, in many places, the confraternities become not only religious bodies, but they become it's how the Indians will govern themselves, right? Independent of their colonial masters, whatever the colonial masters want to do with them. In general, the colonial masters are called the peninsulares. They tend to be people that come from Spain. They're steeped in some version of modern naturalism, and they're basically trying to, carry out some version of Lockean naturalism or Scottish Enlightenment naturalism or Machiavellianism in balancing the various forces that they see in Latin America. So in other words, the political religious approach is generally regal. And remember, the regalist approach to religion is basically the state controls pretty much everything. The only thing that Rome and the bishops really have control over is, if they're lucky, how the sacraments are performed, right? But even there's extreme regalists who will even say, the state, and actually in many cases the church lets them do this. The state actually can run the seminaries. The state can determine who can become a priest. The state basically determines who becomes a bishop, right? And in the case of France, in the regalist policies of France, the state actually determines whether a citizen, whether a layman or a laywoman can receive the final sacraments, right? These are the good Christians of the 18th century. These are not the revolutionaries yet. Okay? So in the 1770s and 70s, for example, in the 1770s in France, Louis XV laicizes 26,000 religious. Because in this effort to centralize, he and his advisors basically determined, all these religious orders out there and these devotions, they're economically inefficient, right? And also they through the confessional, they give advice to the women about, things like how you should pay and what the government should or should not do. And so we just got to stop this advice giving through the confessional, right? And all these religious people are holding the women under their spell, and then the women are forcing the husbands to act various ways. And we just got to put an end to this. And how do you put an end to it? You just eliminate inefficient religious orders, right? So Louis XV I'm just giving you an example of regalist policy. So Louis XV shuts down a lot. I forget the number now, but it's hundreds of monasteries. And he's the good guy. Louis XVI is the good guy, right? But Louis XV, he's a Catholic at least. Right? He goes to confession before he dies, after 30 years. So, in Spain, the regalist king, the reformer, it's one of the Charleses, I forget his name, he shuts down hundreds of monasteries and laicizes, thousands of priests and nuns. In Poland, on the eve of the French Revolution, the Polish had lost their state because they had a weird democracy where any one noble could object to a law and it wouldn't go into effect. It was like every noble had the right of veto, right? So you talk about Russia colluding. Actually, in that case, Catherine the Great established friendships with a number of Polish aristocrats. And she was able to influence them to veto every law that was against Russia. And eventually that did help her to take parts of Russia when Russia was partitioned, right? Poland, when it was partitioned, right? But in Poland, Poland was also extremely naturalist at this point. I mean, Poland produces a lot of generals that they come to the United States to fight with the revolutionaries for what they think is the naturalist cause of the time. So I think on the eve of the French Revolution, there's 40 monasteries left in Poland. Let me just give you a sense of the thinking of the time, by the good Christian kings. Right? These are the people that will be done away with during the French Revolution. Yes.
So when you talk about the colonial governance and the regalist tradition, is that the Spanish policy or is that also the French policy?
It's more the Spanish policy.
Okay.
I mean, the French had very limited presence in Latin America. It was basically Haiti.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah. Okay. And that didn't go well. Second of all, I'm a little confused. But what you traditionally hear is that the Spaniards treated the Indians much worse than the freedom of the English. Well, mainly because all the Indians were
Than the English?
Yes.
What?
That's absurd.
You said the Spanish treated their...
Yeah.
Oh, the British treated the Indians
Where are
far worse
Yeah,
than the
what are you talking
Spanish,
about?
I would say.
Wicked history.
Yeah, I
man.
mean, maybe that's where it's coming from.
Well, I would say even though
mass enslavement,
let's not.
huge labor camps in Peru, and
Yeah, but
Where was their interbreeding?
but they weren't killing them, right? And there were some who interbred. I mean, there were mestizos at this point,
yeah, there were
right?
They still exist. Where though?
But they didn't adopt a policy of genocide and ethnic cleansing with the Indians,
yeah.
right? I mean, they treated them according to the naturalist, enlightened ways of treating Indians at that time, which was exactly what you described. But they weren't butchering them. They weren't committing genocide. They weren't driving them off their lands. I mean, the British model was just if you can't make them a slave, just kill them, right?
Yeah. So
I don't see how that's more just.
Yeah, no, but why? Sorry to. But what exactly? What's your question? Where did this happen? Exactly. Where in British colonies?
In North America,
Okay.
in the United States of America,
Okay.
land of the free, home of the brave.
And then last thing was.
No, but anyway.
No, last thing was so it was Louis. Was Louis the 14th or sorry Louis the 15th, Louis the 16th at least. I thought
Louis the 15th.
Louis the 15th.
Yeah.
That shut down the monastery.
Yeah.
What was my ask?
No, but I think you could say that. I mean, the Spaniards they were basically regalists and naturalists at this point. There were debates within Spain whether the Indians were human or not. Though the Catholics did come down and decide that they're human, right? I think slavery is a good example of something where once Europe starts to become more materialist and naturalist in its approach, it starts to have less and less a problem with slavery until the 19th century, right? So I don't see. The point is not to. I don't want to get into these big debates about is Britain more just or more unjust than Spain, right? I'm just saying this is the regalist naturalist approach to governance. And could they commit a lot of injustices? Yes, absolutely.
And I don't know if this is maybe a moot point, but you call France a state at this point.
France was a state.
Okay.
Yeah. Or a nation. I mean, it was a nation at this point.
Okay.
Yes.
What's the difference between a nation and a state?
Well, the concept of a state. I mean, you could say a nation ultimately is a people that has the same identity, and they get an organizational structure to govern the relationships between that people, and it's somewhat more rooted in the idea of ethnic identity. Whereas a state would just be an institutional structure that could govern a geographic territory independent of nation. By this point, there is a French state.
Okay.
The state emerges right after the Reformation, the concept of state. Yes.
Is this the sort of broad stroke here that the regalists in power in the European nations, for sort of an unclear reason, hated the corporate bodies that were the religious institutions, got rid of them, and then that essentially led to revolution?
Well, so in part, when the revolution hits, and the French take out the Spaniards.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we'll get to this, but the revolution hits. Napoleon takes over France. He takes out the king, and he cuts out. He basically also when the Jesuits are suppressed, all the Jesuits have to leave Latin America, right? And so you get a kind of collapse of the church with the suppression of the Jesuits, and also with then what happens in the French Revolution.
It's still, from a political standpoint, it's still kind of unclear to me why the regalists want to get rid of the religious so much.
Because naturalism is leading them. Enlightenment philosophy is leading them to push for centralization, efficiency, and the religious orders are always getting in the way of efficiency, of efficient administration.
Okay.
I mean, the Jesuits have all these reductions. The reductions have almost an independent economy that they're running. They have an independent political economy, an independent political life. They have armies that they can defend themselves against the various nations when they come in. Right, so this is an obstacle to unification and centralization. Yes?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it just basically that, religious orders don't have an intrinsic allegiance to the state?
That's another thing, too.
So they're the Pope's army and all that.
Yeah, you can get all sorts of black legends you can attach to them.
Right, yeah, so in that respect, they're not, unlike the secular clergy and the bishops who are already kind of under the state's arm
Right.
and its garments, the religious orders sort of are kind of operating independently. They
That's
don't
right.
like that because they want control.
Right,
And they don't know what they're doing, they can't easily control them.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Right, so I guess they're fine with these bishops then, obviously.
Bishops are always easy to control in the history of the church. It's easy to find fawning, craven bishops to the regime throughout the entire history of the church.
But they're Catholic.
They're baptized Catholics, and they're ordained validly as priests, right? So also, it's during this time that obviously, because there's a network. I don't understand completely how the network exists, but there is a network that attaches, for example, Diderot and the Radical Enlightenment to elements, Masonic lodges at this point in Latin America. So, and it's in the 1750s and 60s where you start to see the first literature among the members of the Radical Enlightenment about how the Indians were actually, before the Spaniards showed up, before the Catholic Church showed up, the Indians were full of love for one another. They were actually proto-atheist humanists, right? And it was only the arrival of the Spaniards and the Catholic Church that corrupted them, right?
It's like Rousseau.
This would be Diderot. Diderot pushes this idea in the Encyclopedia, and it's also pushed in the history of the two Indies, the philosophical history of the two Indies. It's also during this time in the 1740s and 50s, you get the first kind of novel. You still see these kind of novels made into movies, right? It's like, so where there's like a woman from Peru, she's a poor little Indian. She's eventually freed from the chains of Catholicism. She discovers her sexuality. She has a bunch of, male lovers. And then she finally, the end of the novel is she fully embraces atheistic humanism, right, which is her kind of true freedom. And you'll still see, in Europe, they still make movies like this, like, the Danish theater or, the Scandinavian film company or whatever. And sometimes you'll see them on planes, right? But no, but these movies are still made. It's like a trope. It's like a narrative trope. And these novels like this will still get popularized in Latin America. It's like a classic narrative trope of freedom from Catholic, somehow through a bunch of adventures, which are usually immoral, the person gets freed from Catholicism and embraces some sort of atheistic humanism. Right? Yes?
Is atheistic humanism just some idea of like noble, I don't know, like, what is atheistic humanism? What's humanism?
It's the machine, it's the universal materialist system that gives us all the rights of freedom and equality. Or it's any materialist system that's somehow going to lead to balance or equality or freedom or true development independent of God, the principles of the common good, the Catholic Church. In Asia, essentially at this time in Asia, they're fed up with the Europeans and they shut their doors, right? By this time in this 18th century, right? They want nothing to do. In the Ottoman Empire, they haven't yet suffered any serious. So the Ottoman Empire from the 12th century until the 1750s had not suffered in their mind, any serious military losses. But beginning in the 1770s and 80s and 90s, they're going to start suffering serious military losses. One, because of the rise of nationalism within the Ottoman Empire itself. The Ottoman Empire governs 120 nations from North Africa, the Atlantic coast of North Africa, to the Pacific. Right? And they don't start suffering serious losses until the 1790s. But during this time, 1740s, 50s, you start to get some, like the Serbs at one point, rise up in rebellion. Right? And actually, this is the origin of a lot of modern-day problems in Yugoslavia, because the Serbs, they're living somewhere within the confines of the Ottoman Empire, and they basically rise in rebellion, and they free themselves from the Ottoman Empire, and they all move to what present-day Serbia, which they kind of consider their homeland. Right? And the Austrians welcome them because of various political shenanigans that are going on at the time between them and the Ottoman Empire. So at this point, the Russians at this point sense that the Ottoman Empire is weakening. And the Russians start thinking, well, actually, if the Ottoman Empire starts to crumble, we can take it over. And we can maybe achieve a goal we kind of have now, which is to get a port on the Indian Ocean. Get a southern port, like way down there. And we might be able to do it if the Ottoman Empire falls apart, right? Russia itself at this time starts to get the idea, maybe we're the country that God wants to unify the Orthodox world, because Constantinople has fallen. But under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Russia, they basically start to incorporate a lot of also European naturalism into their borders, into their educational system, and into their seminaries in Russia. So we want to get to Louis, now we want to enter into the French Revolution. In many ways, as we've already said, even before the French Revolution, the Regalists in Europe had already carried out a kind of revolution in which they were trying basically to make their countries, to mold their countries more in the model of some version of the Enlightenment. One place, there's one country that revolts, where it's actually a democratic revolt against the efforts, and that somewhat succeeds, that revolts against the efforts of establishing a kind of regalist naturalism. And that's basically Joseph II in Austria. He was a huge reformer of the church. Like, he shut down seminaries, he reorganized dioceses, he fired bishops and reappointed them. He was really big on reorganizing the church, oftentimes to the horror of his wife and to the horror of a lot of the women in his family who were more, faithful or devout or whatever you want to call them, Catholics. But one place where Joseph II was like, I really don't like Belgium. They have all these devotions to the Sacred Heart, right? They have a lot of these religious orders. So Joseph II basically set out to like really lay down the hammer on Belgium, one of his provinces. And they revolted against him, and they won, right? They basically won to defend the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I mean, that was kind of the, because they didn't have like any strong notion of like, we should defend our economic rights or the rights of labor at this point. It was just Belgium for the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I mean, that was basically it. So, and I get actually, just to say also, during the French Revolution, the Belgians will they will revolt against the revolutionaries. One of the places it kind of goes up in flames in the 1790s is the Belgians. And basically the revolutionaries, I think in 1792, they decide, well, look, the Belgians just don't know how to be free, right? So we have to go in there and just give them freedom, right? Just in a way that they will accept it. Freedom at gunpoint, you know? Yeah. They have to be forced to be free. Yeah. And then another time, then in the 1830s, once again, the Belgians will revolt against the I guess at one point, Belgium was given to the Netherlands after the Napoleonic Wars. And then in the 1830s, once again, they revolt for basically beer and the Sacred Heart of Christ. Right? And actually, but we'll get to that story. So, basically, in the 1780s, Louis XVI comes to power. How did Louis XV educate Louis XVI? He basically gave him a Rousseauian education. That's how popular Rousseau was. That's how convinced the elite were that Rousseau was the wave of the future. Louis XVI, who dies a martyr for the faith, who ought to be canonized, even though he had some weak points. But look, if you can canonize Paul VI and John the 23rd, you can canonize Louis XVI.
Whoa.
So sorry, but Louis XVI, so he's not. No one's talking about opening his cause just because.
He does have a cause opened, yes.
He's got a cause open.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Because he died a martyr. He died a martyr of the faith. I think he's one of these martyrs though that for probably political reasons.
Yeah,
Thomas More wasn't canonized till the 1920s.
Right.
Because it was a delicate political situation for Catholics in England for so long. I don't see his canonization coming in anytime soon. But as far as a diplomat and a politician, he had the same weaknesses that John the 23rd and Paul VI had as diplomats and politicians. So and actually as he approached his death, he was very holy. He was receiving communion every day. He was 2 hours of prayer. He lived a life of mortification. If any sense, what did him in as far as his own death in the end was he always wanted, because of Rousseau, he always wanted to get the will of the people, right? And in a way that's what did him in. He was always too kind to the people, what he understood to be the people.
Yeah.
And it was always manipulated who the people were, as we'll see, but he was educated in the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And all the advisors around him were all immersed in various forms of naturalist economy. So one of the problems in the 1780s with Louis XVI is that he goes through like 4 economic advisors, and one will implement laissez-faire capitalism, and and laissez-faire capitalism plus austerity, right? And then also all sorts of people end up unemployed, all sorts of people are in debt, a whole segment of the population gets into famine within 2 years, and then he says, well, maybe this wasn't so good. So then he'll hire a new minister, right? But the old minister was really popular so also in the 1780s, many nobles in France they're imitating the British, and they're essentially saying, we're not really nobles, we're the new elite. We're the new economic elite. And France is someday going to change. Change is coming, right? At some point, we're going to help change come about. And also, we're probably we don't really care so much about the title of noble. They're already jockeying for position, so that when they drop their titles of nobility, they'll become the new economic elite of France, right? They kind of see this coming. And of course, they divide among various schools amongst themselves of, what economic techniques are the most successful for gathering up wealth, because wealth is going to be the foundation of power. As that they're just aping Britain at this point. I mean, they're not saying it's good or bad. They're just saying, well, that's what the Whigs did in Britain. This is what's going to happen in France. So we better gather up wealth now for when the regime changes, we're going to be the new governing elite. That's kind of how they saw it. Because of problems that develop in the 1780s, by 1788, Louis XVI decides, in 1788, so one of the things that happens in 1780s, wages for laborers drop rapidly. Because the new elite start to realize, well, laborers are not persons, they're just mechanisms of production. Right? That's what they're being taught by the likes of Adam Smith and the physiocrats and the people at Scotch Enlightenment. Right? These are just individuals. So if you can drop their wages to subsistence living, and you can get all the money for yourself. So at one point in Grenoble in the 1787, 1788, basically the nobles passed laws basically saying no longer can the parliaments, the courts, no longer can they do anything to defend the wages of laborers. And they dropped the price of the workers in Grenoble, and the workers go up into a revolt. There's no Marxism at this time, so you can't say it's socialist either. Socialism isn't invented till 1830. Okay. So at this point, they send in the army shoots up a bunch of workers, and when Louis XVI finds out, he's horrified. He had nothing to do with it. He didn't tell the nobles to do what they did, but the nobles, everybody starts blaming Louis XVI for the tile workers. They call it the tile revolt, because when the army was coming in, all the workers went up onto the roofs of the houses and buildings, and they started throwing the tiles from the roofs down on the army as they were coming in to shoot the workers, right? So Louis XVI decides at this point he really wants to hear from the people, right? And because he really wants to hear from the people, he says, we're going to call the Estates General. But in this year leading up to the Estates General, we're going to consult the people, and we're going to hear from them what they think is important. Right? And actually, the Marxists, what's interesting about the French Revolution, the French Revolution is the first historical event about which people try to do political philosophy about the event, during the event. Like they say, this historical event has philosophical meaning. Right? So Kant, the day he hears about the opening of the French Revolution, Kant writes in his diary, "Lord, now your servant can die in peace, because he has seen the light of the nations." Right? In the lodge of Edmund Burke. So Mary Wollstonecraft and Edmund Burke belonged to the same Masonic lodge in London at this point, right? And the leader of this lodge is a guy named Richard Price, who's good friends with John Adams, with Benjamin Franklin, with Thomas Jefferson, right? And they're all like part of the same, intellectual clique at this point. Richard Price says the exact same thing in the speech he gives at the opening of the French Revolution. "Lord, now you can let your servant die in peace, because he has seen the light of the nations." Right? So with that kind of start, people start reflecting philosophically on what this means. The Marxists, so basically, I think up until the 1980s, it was really hard to get objective research on the French Revolution. But actually, there's a numerary in Spain. He comes from Spain. He went to France. He became a historian. He became friends with a French historian named Francois Furet. Right? He helped Furet come back to the faith. And Furet was like the dean of French historians of the French Revolution. And Furet, after he converts in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he begins this whole new school of French history about the French Revolution, basically saying, we got to say objectively what actually happened. But only in the 1980s you start to get that. Because from the time of the French Revolution until the 1980s, the historiography was controlled by either radicals or Marxists in the French Academy. So, but one thing they did do, which is what Marxists tend to do, is that they spent a lot of time studying these files that were created. Actually, Louis XVI was genuine about this. He said, like, I want anybody in France. He did some sort of administrative organization. I want anybody in France who has a complaint to write it down. Right, and so
As a complaint?
like well, how the system should be improved,
Yeah.
how France should be improved. And so there's been studies now, and these are the kinds of things that the people were asking for, right? Improved infrastructure. You know, the bridge in my town is out. The bridge in my town is out. There's holes in the road. You know, this kind of stuff. Improved infrastructure, higher paying jobs.
Yeah.
Their self-reporting is in the last 10 years, with all these new economic programs, we've only gone into greater debt, and our wages have gotten lowered. And it seems like the only people that have benefited from this are the filthy, dirty nobles,
The swamp.
right? So then, the other thing they're saying is we want more food. We want bread. There's a lot of complaints about, like, we want more bread because of the economic programs of the last 10 years, all this new experimentation, we've gone hungry many winters. Okay? They actually, the Kahirs, the files say, they're called Kahirs in French. The files say, we want to see more exercise of the executive power of the king. Because he's the only one who cares about us. Right? Because they're basically not convinced that the nobles care for them. Because it seems like from the standpoint of the average Frenchman at this point, the nobles are just power hungry and money hungry. They want less austerity. They want less laissez-faire policies. Because only the nobles and the new emerging elite seem to be benefiting from them. So, we've gone over time.